Despite a 7-6 record in 2021, Tennessee exceeded expectations, and I think that they did well for year one under Josh Heupel. In 2020, Tennessee went 3-7 under head coach Jeremy Pruitt. They had the 109th best offense in the nation, scoring 21.5 points per game. Meanwhile, their defense was 69th in the country and allowed 30.1 points per game. The team was just terrible, whether it was the defense, whether it was Jarrett Garantano and his atrocious decision-making, whether it was Jeremy Pruitt being a, let's be honest here, scumbag and handing money to recruits in McDonald's bags that tore apart Tennessee's 2021 recruiting class and nearly tore apart the 2021 football team, as because of Jeremy Pruitt's actions, there was a possibility that Josh Heupel in year one, even if he did do well and got a record that could allow him to go bowling, there was a possibility that he couldn't go bowling altogether because of Jeremy Pruitt's actions. And it turned out that Tennessee luckily was able to participate in a bowl game this past season. Again, they reached a 7-6 record. They went from having the 109th offense or scoring offense to the 7th scoring offense, scoring nearly 40 points per game. Their defense was 90th in the country out of 130 teams, but they technically improved scoring-wise by only allowing 29.1 points per game. It just goes to show you that, like, going from 69th to 90th, despite technically improving in allowed points per game, shows that how terrible most defenses were in the COVID year, especially because of a lot of those practices where you couldn't tackle, etc. You saw that immediately in the Navy BYU game, how much that just hurt everyone. But anyway, back to the topic of the video. I just want to talk about today about Tennessee football and how I think that this team, they're not contenders in the way of national contenders. They don't have the talent yet. It's year two of what will probably be more than 1 year of a rebuild project. You still have Georgia and Alabama to deal with on an annual basis, who are so much more talented, better assistant coaches, more resources. But Tennessee's 2023 recruiting class is doing well. They had a good 2022 recruiting class, and it looks like they're going to be even more successful in 2022, going from that 7-win mark to, I think, an 8 or 9-win mark. I have them going 8-4. I'm going to discuss why, discuss their schedule, but I think they have a legitimate shot at contending for the SEC East. And it's not that they're close to Georgia or anything, but upsets do happen. And I think that Tennessee, with Hendon Hooker, Bru McCoy, and Cedric Tillman, are one of the few passing offenses that can truly make Georgia's defense uncomfortable. And last year you saw that in the SEC championship game. And I guess this is where we're going to begin, is just why I think Tennessee can actually contend for the SEC East. And it's because Georgia last year, you saw it in the SEC championship game. You even saw it somewhat with Tennessee. You saw it with, I would even say, Michigan in the Orange Bowl, even though it didn't amount to anything because of poor red zone production. Georgia's front seven was their strength. Their secondary, if you're to beat Georgia, make their defense uncomfortable, make moves against them, you had to pass against them. And you especially had to target that secondary. Alabama tore it apart. They tore it apart with John Mechie and Jamison Williams. And unfortunately for Alabama, those two players were injured by the second quarter of the national title game. If just one of them were healthy, there's probably a strong debate as to say that Alabama would be the national champions, because Bryce Young and a elite wide receiver just tore apart Georgia's secondary. And here what we have with Tennessee is you have Hendon Hooker, you have Cedric Tillman, and you have incoming transfer Bru McCoy, who I would say is blue chip talent, elite talent. And you have those three. And granted, if the offensive line improves, I think Tennessee allowed around the 40 amount of sacks, I think, around that 40 mark, which is nothing to be proud of. But they returned 4 out of 5 offensive linemen We'll get into that a little later. But they return enough production on offense. O-line, they get a good transfer in Bru McCoy. They have Cedric Tillman returning, and he had 1,081 yards last year, 12 receiving touchdowns, 16.9 yards per reception. Most importantly, you have Hendon Hooker, who can actually get great wide receivers the ball, place it perfectly. He passed for 2,945 yards, which was 37th in the nation. He threw for 31 touchdowns, which was 12th in the nation. Only 3 interceptions, which was tied for 2nd in the nation. And he had a 77.9 QB rating according to ESPN, which was 16th in the nation. And he had a 182 passer rating, which was among one of the best in the nation. It was certainly top 10, possibly top 5. I know CJ Stroud, I think his was pretty high, and I know that Grayson McCall was the highest, but I think a 180 passer rating, that was certainly higher than what Bryce Young achieved. I think his was in the 160s, 70s, 50s, from what I can remember. Tennessee is a solid QB and wide receiver duo. It's something that I don't think the rest of the SEC East has outside of, possibly Georgia. And I think that Hendon Hooker and Cedric Tillman are a much better duo than, let's just say, Stetson Bennett and Adonai Mitchell, Stetson Bennett, or, let's just go to Brock Bowers because I think he's their best offensive player, or Ladd McConkey, or whatever. I think that in the SEC East, Tennessee has the best QB wide receiver duo. Now, of course, offensive line matters. It's the backbone of an offense, and Georgia has the best of that. But outside of, you put Tennessee and Georgia together, and you take them out. Who else in the SEC East has that QB wide receiver duo that can target Georgia and make them uncomfortable? I don't see it personally. You look at Kentucky. You have Will Levis. I don't get why there's a lot of hype around him, but even if the hype around him is deserved, Wan'Dale Robinson is gone. He's off to the NFL. South Carolina, you do have Spencer Rattler, and they did bring in a lot from the portal. They're not nearly as talented as Tennessee, though. Florida might be the closest thing in regards to that with Anthony Richardson and the fact that they still have a decent chunk of talent left. But they did have a lot of portal departures. I don't know if Justin Shorter or any of their great wide receivers are still there. Missouri, Vanderbilt, they at this point are the bottom feeders of the East, at least from what we can gather. I have Tennessee finishing second in the SEC East, personally. They start off with Ball State, which is obviously going to be a win. And then they have their next game. The Ball State game is September 1st on a Thursday. Saturday, September 10th, they travel to Pittsburgh. Despite Pittsburgh losing Kenny Pickett and Jordan Addison, I still like this Pittsburgh team because of Habakkuk Baldonado, that amazing defensive line. They return Israel Abanikanda at running back and the majority of their O-line, and Keaton Slovis, and I forget his name. I think it's Nick Patty, the backup QB from Pittsburgh, I thought looked good last year in the few moments that he played. I think that Pittsburgh's being very underrated despite their 2 losses, but that Tennessee versus Pittsburgh game is huge. It's at Heinz Field, not too much of a home field advantage there. You could see a lot of orange. Tennessee will definitely have the QB wide receiver advantage. It'll be interesting to see, though. This will be a good early test for Tennessee's offensive line against a Pittsburgh D-line that was top 5 in sacks last year, very effective at getting to the QB, providing pressure, just very effective at shutting down offenses in general and dominating the line of scrimmage. This will be an early test for Tennessee that at the current moment, I do have Tennessee losing this game. I could see them winning it, though. I think it's going to be a very close and competitive game. And by the end of the preseason, by August, I might change my mind on this depending on some of my thoughts and more information I gather. But then Tennessee will return home the following week to play Akron, which I think will be a win. They'll also return to open up finally in conference to play the Florida Gators, which I think will be a solid win. It's going to be Billy Napier's first year. Tennessee surprisingly is the more solidified team, and because of Dan Mullen's poor recruiting, I think Tennessee actually has a raw talent advantage here. As a result, I do have this as a win for the Volunteers. Up next, Tennessee has a bye week, October 1st. They then travel to play at LSU, which I think Tennessee will possibly be favored in that game, and I do think Tennessee will be the better team than LSU, but I think it's Tiger Stadium. Louisiana State just has so much raw talent. I have this as an upset win, a win that I think that Tennessee, more often than not, if you were to play a multiple game series, would probably win this game. Not very high on LSU, but I think for this one game, because in college football, there are no game series to determine who wins a specific game like in the NBA playoffs. There's just one game, and I think that one game goes to LSU. Tennessee then hosts Alabama, a game that I don't give Tennessee a great chance to win, but Tennessee has a better chance than a lot of people are giving them credit for. Alabama hasn't lost to Tennessee since the 2000s, since I think either Nick Saban's first year or years before that, since the Phil Fulmer era, not even the end of the Phil Fulmer era, like the middle late period of the Phil Fulmer era. It's getting closer and closer to 2 decades since Tennessee has won this game. I don't think they're going to win it this year, but they were competitive last year for moments, and I think that they could certainly be more competitive this year with home field advantage, a great quarterback and wide receiver duo. The problem is Alabama's defense, which I think will be pretty similar to Georgia's defense last year. You have Jordan Battle, you have Will Anderson, who you can't forget about, you have Kool-Aid McKinstry, you have so many different names on that defense, and then you have Bryce Young and Jermaine Burton to target that Tennessee defense, who still has a lot to improve on. After Alabama, the Vols will return home to face University of Tennessee Martin, and they will host Kentucky the following weekend on October 29th. I think those will be 2 convincing wins, helped by home field advantage and Tennessee's offense, and what I think will be an improved defense. What I think Tennessee's most important game is traveling to Sanford Stadium and taking on Georgia. Now, Georgia, much better team, talent-wise, coaching-wise. They have home field advantage too, so this looks like it could be Tennessee's hardest game of the year. I don't necessarily think it is. I actually think Alabama's the hardest game of the year, and I think that's because, A, Alabama will have a better defense, Alabama has it out for Tennessee, and Alabama has the better quarterback. Now, that isn't to discredit anything that Georgia has done. Georgia returns a lot on offense, but Tennessee here does have a matchup advantage, I think, with their quarterback and wide receiver duo against Georgia's secondary, who lost a lot of guys to the NFL draft, Lewis Sine being one of them, and they also lost some guys to the portal. Amir Speed, who was a backup but started in some games, and then there was another guy who was decently rated who's going over to Arkansas, I think. And Kirby did mention some depth concerns at secondary. Tennessee has a better shot to win this game than I think they do the Alabama game. It's still a slim chance, and for that, I do have them losing to Georgia. And then finally, Tennessee returns home to face Missouri. They travel to South Carolina and travel to Vanderbilt to close out their season, which I think will be a 3-game win streak to finish 8-4, 5-3 in conference. A year where the Volunteers certainly improve off of last year. Tennessee overall, I think, does have a bright future. They have an elite QB and a great wide receiver room. You have Hendon Hooker, again, Bru McCoy, Cedric Tillman. They're going to be amazing next year. I think Hendon Hooker, his numbers and his TD-INT ratio may not be better, at least his efficiency metrics might not be, but I think he will overall be a better quarterback. I think he's going to throw for more touchdowns. He's going to cross that 3,000-yard mark, and he's going to lead Tennessee to some shootout victories, which I think is the way that Tennessee is comfortable in winning. Just look at the Kentucky game from last year where they won 45-42 at Kentucky, who was a top 20 team. Look at the fact they scored 10 points on Georgia in the first quarter. They did fall asleep for the rest of the game, which is something that from what I could understand, was sort of a common theme last year for Tennessee. They have to improve upon that, and I think they will as well, in part thanks to this QB and wide receiver duo. They're also recruiting great at said positions. You look at Tennessee's 2023 recruiting class, they got a commit from five-star quarterback Nicholas Iamaleava from Long Beach, California. He's ranked 4th nationally. He's 3rd at the QB position, behind Arch Manning, obviously, and then Malachi Nelson, I think, who's also from California. They also are recruiting, or they have gotten a commit from Ethan Davis from Georgia, who's a top 100 tight end, 6th at his position. And while their only wide receiver commit currently is a 3-star Nate Spillman, who's from Tennessee, they are in the running for Carnell Tate. Carnell Tate is a 5-star wide receiver. Is being heavily recruited by Ohio State and Tennessee. It seems pretty split here. A lot of Ohio State fans, I'm a Big Ten channel, so I get a lot of interaction from them. A lot of Ohio State fans and insiders do think that Tennessee has a solid chance that they might even be the favorites to land him. Others say otherwise. It's pretty split, but they're recruiting very well at this position. Their NIL game, which is critical for modern recruiting, is huge. They got Nico Iamaleava a massive NIL deal. I heard from someone it was $8 million. I heard from many sources, not just the one person, that it was millions of dollars. So they're recruiting well at said positions, and that means that if this year they don't contend for the SEC East, they don't contend for that, they don't even reach the SEC championship game or don't get close, at least this means that the future is bright, because recruiting is the lifeblood of college football, and seeing Tennessee continue to get great QBs to come here, recruit 5-star QBs and wide receivers, is a solid thing to see. Also the schedule, which we did already talk about, but it gives Tennessee an opportunity. You host Alabama, and I would rather host my toughest game of the year, host the toughest game I have to face, than play away against them. And that matchup advantage with Georgia, I'm telling you, it's at Sanford Stadium. It's going to be a tough game, but Tennessee can use that mismatch to their advantage, I think. Georgia loses a lot on that defense, and while most, including myself, expect that defense to mostly reload, we don't know. That unit will never lack talent, thanks to Kirby Smart's amazing recruiting, and thanks to Will Muschamp and Glenn Schumann being on that defensive staff as defensive coordinator for Schumann, co-defensive coordinator for Will Muschamp. Those two are great recruiters and developers of defensive talent as well, but we'll have to see, because that defense last year was generational talent. The offense was not something that was going to win them games on their own without the help of the defense, and you saw that in the SEC championship game. When the defense breaks down and is uncomfortable, the offense isn't going to bail Georgia out. So Tennessee, if they want to beat Georgia, they have to make that defense uncomfortable. With their QB wide receiver duo, I certainly think they can. I think that Tennessee hosting Kentucky helps, because outside of Georgia and Alabama, I personally see the Kentucky game, or maybe the game at South Carolina, being the hardest. And Tennessee has talent advantages over a lot of those schools. At LSU, I have as an upset, but I think it's a game that Tennessee could very likely win. Same thing with the game at Pittsburgh. So 9 to 10 wins is not out of the picture for Tennessee, I don't think. I had their ceiling at 9-3, but after looking at their schedule just yesterday and today while recording this video, I actually think that 10-2 is a pretty realistic ceiling for the Volunteers. Another critical thing is the offensive line returns 4 out of 5 starters. Any offensive line that returns that much production is bound for improvement. Last year, Hendon Hooker, you look at just his statistics, and he was sacked 36 times. I think Joe Milton and some of the other quarterbacks were sacked more as well. Again, like I said, that offense allowed around 40 sacks, which you just can't have. You can't have if you want to win games and be ultra competitive. You cannot have an offensive line that is that poor at pass protection. Granted, they faced Alabama and Georgia. They have to every year. So some of those numbers might be inflated just because of how the Tennessee offensive line faced two elite pass rush teams. But the offensive line needs to improve if Tennessee wants to compete in the SEC, and this returning production certainly supports that they are certainly capable of competing. According to ourlads.com, this is the projected Tennessee offensive lineup. Left tackle, you have Jeremiah Crawford. Left guard, you have Jerome Carvin. The offensive center is Cooper Mays. Javontes Spraggins is the right guard, and Darnell Wright is the right tackle. And last, but certainly not least, Tennessee, they do have a very underrated running back room, at least in my opinion. Let's talk about Jabari Small, a guy who had 792 yards, 9 rushing touchdowns, 5.7 yards per carry. He returns, along with Jalen Wright backing him up, and Justin Williams-Thomas, a freshman, is listed as third on the depth chart according to ourlads.com. If the offensive line improves, the run game is likely to improve as well, and Jabari Small's numbers, which, no, he didn't cross 1,000 yards, but Tennessee's more of a passing team anyway, from what I can gather. That 5.7 yards per carry is going to go up, the rushing touchdown numbers are going to go up, the 792 rushing yards are going to go up too. Jabari Small is a good player. He has what it takes to be a good running back, a great running back. And I think that a good run game, along with what I think can be an elite passing game for Tennessee, of course we'll have to see how the games are played and such, that can give Tennessee's offense a massive edge. It was already, what was it? 7th in the country last year, 39.3 points per game. When it came to running the football, Tennessee on average rushed for 218 yards per game, passing for 257 yards per game. I think that both of those numbers have a really realistic chance of improving. Everyone's talking about, again, that they're talking about Hendon Hooker, Bru McCoy, Cedric Tillman, but 218 rushing yards per game, that's great. And I think that Tennessee's offense, with all these improvements, can certainly reach north of that 40 points per game mark, which means that, obviously, their offense is going to be a challenge to stop. And that's all I have to say for this video. Those are the reasons why I think Tennessee has a bright future. They're recruiting well. They return a hefty amount of offensive talent. And where they don't return talent or possibly lack production and efficiency, they bring in transfers, most notably Bru McCoy at the wide receiver position. Obviously, their defense has to improve, but I think that with their offense improving and just Tim Banks being in his second year as a defensive coordinator, he got some experience under his belt. It's going to help the defense, period. Amen. I have Tennessee going 8-4, 5-3 in the SEC, and 9-10 wins is certainly within reach for the Volunteers. If you like this video and want to see more college football content, more Big Ten football content, even more SEC football content, I think I'm going to talk about each team of my top 25, dedicate a whole video to them, and try and speak about all those teams, why I think they're going to be great, just talk about them in depth with analysis. And there'll be SEC teams. There'll even be Tennessee in that video. It's going to be different from this one, but if you want to see that, see a lot more college football content, make sure to leave a like, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video and on what you think about Tennessee football down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.